You ever notice how a machine goes quiet right before it refuses to listen? The sound came first, not the voice, a dry metallic grind echoing across the hangar floor before collapsing into a hollow silence that felt heavier than any alarm, the kind that made seasoned engineers shift their weight without knowing why, the kind that made a $90 million jet look suddenly small under the harsh white lights of Bay 12. Ryan Cole stood beneath the left intake, jaw tight, grease on his gloves, staring at the silent engine as if it had just insulted him personally. Then he kicked the landing gear with the side of his boot, not hard enough to damage anything but enough to let the frustration out, the dull thud swallowed by the open space as a few technicians nearby exchanged glances, their tablets still glowing green with diagnostic confirmations that everything was within operational parameters, a phrase that meant nothing now. Run it again, Ryan snapped, though he already knew the result, and somewhere behind the hum of idle equipment, the starter engaged once more, a rising whine that should have led to ignition, to life, to power, but instead it choked halfway through and died like it had the first 3 times, leaving behind only that same unnatural quiet. Lieutenant Mason Blake stood a few feet back, arms crossed, posture rigid, watching the team unravel with the controlled impatience of someone who believed in systems, in protocols, in the idea that if something failed, it was because someone hadn't followed instructions correctly, not because the machine itself had decided otherwise. "We've got command waiting on this bird," he said, voice clipped, eyes scanning the crew as if the problem might confess under pressure. "I need solutions, not guesses." No one answered. The hangar carried its own kind of tension now, the air thick with the low hum of electronics and the faint smell of heated metal, and at the far edge of it all, near a stack of unused tool crates, an old man stood quietly, hands tucked into the pockets of a worn brown jacket that had seen better decades, his posture relaxed in a way that didn't match the urgency around him, his pale blue eyes fixed not on the engineers, not on the officer, but on the jet itself, as if he were listening to something no one else could hear. He hadn't been there a moment ago, or at least no one had noticed him until now, which was how it always seemed to happen with men like him. They appeared not with noise, but with presence, subtle and uninvited. Airman Lucas Reed was the first to really look, his gaze lingering a second longer than it should have, something about the stillness of the old man setting off a quiet alarm in the back of his mind. But before he could say anything, Ryan let out a sharp breath and turned, catching sight of the stranger. "Hey," he called, irritation bleeding into his voice, "this is a restricted maintenance bay. You lost or something?" The old man didn't answer right away, didn't react the way most people would when challenged. He simply shifted his gaze from the engine to Ryan, calm, measured, like he'd heard far worse questions in far louder places. For a brief second, the hangar felt even quieter, like the building itself was waiting, and then somewhere above them, a loose cable swayed slightly in the conditioned air, tapping softly against a metal beam, a small, almost forgettable sound that somehow made everything else feel sharper, more defined. Lieutenant Blake stepped forward, already done with the situation. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step outside," he said, authority polished and firm, the kind of tone designed to end conversations before they began, but the old man didn't move, didn't argue, didn't even shift his weight. He just looked back at the jet, eyes narrowing slightly, as if the machine had just said something worth considering, and in that moment, without raising his voice, without announcing himself, he spoke. Quiet enough that it should have been lost in the space, but it wasn't. "That engine," he said slowly, almost thoughtfully, "doesn't like being rushed." The words hung in the air longer than they should have, not loud, not confrontational, but heavy in a way that made Ryan Cole's expression tighten just a fraction before irritation took over again, because in a place built on precision and authority, there was no room for quiet riddles from a man who did not belong there. "It is an engine," Ryan said, wiping his hands on a cloth already dark with grease, his voice edged with a restrained impatience. "It does exactly what the system tells it to do." The old man did not respond to the challenge, did not defend his statement or elaborate. He simply stepped closer to the aircraft, slow and deliberate, each footfall soft against the polished concrete as if he were approaching something alive rather than assembled, and that alone was enough to draw more eyes toward him, enough to shift the balance of attention in the hangar without a single raised voice. Lieutenant Blake moved to intercept, his boots sharp against the floor, authority now fully engaged. "Sir, I gave you a direct instruction," he said, firmer this time, but there was a flicker of hesitation, subtle and almost imperceptible, as the old man stopped just short of the engine intake and looked at it again, not at the panels or the seams or the access points that every technician had already inspected, but at the surface itself, as if the answer was not hidden inside but resting quietly in plain sight. Airman Lucas Reed felt it then, the same quiet tension tightening in his chest, the same unspoken sense that something about this moment was slipping outside the normal rhythm of procedure, and he found himself watching the old man more closely than he was watching the officers, more closely than he was watching the machine. Around them, the equipment hummed, diagnostic screens flickered with steady green confirmations, numbers, and readouts that promised everything was functioning within acceptable tolerances, yet the jet remained silent, stubborn, unmoved by logic or command. Ryan let out a short breath, shaking his head as if to dismiss the entire interruption. "Look," he said, gesturing toward the open panels and the diagnostic stations, "we have run every check in the book. Fuel pressure is stable. Ignition sequence is clean. There is nothing wrong with this system." The old man's eye shifted slightly, not toward Ryan, but toward the narrow seam beneath the intake where a panel sat perfectly aligned, too perfectly aligned, flushed to a degree that suggested precision beyond necessity, and for the first time, he moved his hand, not quickly, not dramatically, just a slow extension of his fingers until they hovered inches from the metal, as if he were waiting for permission that no one had offered. Lieutenant Blake stepped forward again, ready to stop him, but something in the stillness of the moment made him pause, just long enough for the old man's hand to make contact, light, almost weightless, fingertips resting against the cool surface of the engine housing. There was no spark, no visible reaction, nothing that would justify the sudden shift in the room, yet several of the technicians felt it anyway, a subtle change, like the difference between noise and silence when one fades into the other without warning. The old man closed his eyes for a brief second, not in effort, not in concentration, but in recognition, and when he opened them again, his voice came just as quietly as before. "You are listening to the system," he said, his tone steady, almost patient, "but the system is only telling you what it thinks you want to hear." Ryan scoffed under his breath, but it lacked the confidence it had carried moments ago, and Lucas felt his pulse quicken as the pieces began to shift in ways he could not yet explain. "Sir," Lucas said carefully, stepping closer, his voice lower now, respectful without fully understanding why, "what do you mean by that?" The old man did not look at him right away, his gaze still fixed on the engine, his hand unmoving against the metal, and for a moment, the entire hangar seemed to hold its breath, waiting for an answer that had not yet been spoken. The old man finally lifted his hand from the engine, but the absence of contact did not break whatever connection had settled over the space, it only made the silence feel sharper, more deliberate, as if the machine itself was waiting for him to finish speaking before it decided what it would do next. "Systems are designed to confirm," he said slowly, his voice carrying just enough to reach the edges of the gathered crew, not to question. Ryan Cole let out a short laugh, but it was thinner now, less certain, his confidence beginning to fracture under something he could not quite define. "That is not how engineering works," Ryan replied, gesturing toward the diagnostic displays. "These systems detect faults down to fractions of a percent. If something was wrong, we would see it." The old man turned his head slightly then, just enough to acknowledge him, and for the first time his eyes met Ryan's directly, calm, steady, and impossibly certain. "You are seeing exactly what it is willing to show you," he said. That sentence did not land like an argument, it landed like a conclusion, and that difference was enough to shift something deeper in the room. Lieutenant Blake frowned, stepping closer again, his authority now mixed with something else, something quieter, less visible. "Are you suggesting the system is incorrect?" he asked, but the tone had changed, no longer dismissive, now edged with a cautious curiosity he would not have admitted. The old man did not answer right away. Instead, he moved his hand again, this time tracing lightly along the seam beneath the intake, fingers following a line so precise it almost disappeared into the metal, and as he did, the world around him seemed to pull back, not physically, but in memory, in sensation, as if the hum of the hangar was being replaced by something older, something distant. For a brief moment, there was no polished concrete beneath his boots, no fluorescent lights overhead, only the low vibration of machinery under stress, the faint scent of fuel carried on heavy air, and the sound of a pilot's voice cutting through static, tight, controlled, holding steady where others would have broken. His hand had been steadier then, younger, faster, but the feeling was the same quiet certainty that the machine was not failing, it was compensating, hiding something deeper beneath layers of acceptable readings. The memory passed as quickly as it had come, leaving behind only the echo of that understanding, and when he spoke again, his voice carried that weight with it. "Fuel flow," he said, almost to himself, then louder, "it is telling you it is stable, but it is not telling you how it is getting there." Ryan's expression tightened again, defensive instinct rising. "That does not make any sense," he said, shaking his head. "Flow is flow. It is either correct or it is not." "No," the old man replied quietly, "it is either honest or it is not." That was when Lucas felt it fully, the shift from confusion to realization beginning to take shape, incomplete but undeniable, and he glanced at the diagnostic screen, then back at the engine, then back at the old man, his mind racing to connect something he had not been trained to look for. "Sir," Lucas said carefully, stepping closer, "are you saying the readings are compensating for a restriction?" The old man looked at him. Then, really looked at him, and for the first time there was the faintest trace of approval in his expression, subtle but unmistakable. He did not nod, did not confirm outright, but he did not need to. The answer was already there, hanging in the silence between them, waiting for someone else to catch up. Behind them, the diagnostic system continued to glow green, steady, confident, and completely unaware that its authority was beginning to slip. Ryan stared at the engine for a long second, then at the diagnostic display, then back again, as if the answer might reveal itself simply by looking harder, but nothing changed. The numbers remained steady, clean, confident, and that was the problem, though he was not ready to admit it yet. "We already checked for restrictions," he said, his voice firmer now, pushing back against the growing uncertainty. "Fuel lines are clear, pressure is within tolerance, injectors are responding exactly as designed." The old man did not argue, did not counter with technical jargon or overwhelm him with details. He simply stepped half an inch closer and tapped lightly just below the seam he had traced earlier, a small, almost dismissive gesture, but it drew every eye in the hangar to that exact spot. "You checked where the system told you to check," he said, calm and even, "not where the engine is telling you to look." Lieutenant Blake folded his arms tighter, watching the exchange with a focus that had replaced his earlier impatience, his mind working through the implications even as he resisted them. "Be specific," Blake said, the command no longer sharp but measured. "Controlled, what exactly are we missing?" The old man tilted his head slightly, studying the panel as if listening again, and for a moment there was nothing but the distant hum of ventilation fans and the faint clicking of cooling metal, subtle sounds that most people ignored but that seemed to carry meaning for him. "There is a delay," he said finally, "not in the ignition, not in the pressure, but in the response, something small enough to stay within tolerance, but large enough to matter." Ryan frowned, stepping closer despite himself, his earlier resistance giving way to reluctant engagement. "A delay where?" he asked, and this time the question was not dismissive, it was genuine. The old man did not point immediately, he let the silence stretch just long enough to make the answer feel earned, then he placed his finger precisely at the lower edge of the panel. "Right there," he said. "Behind that seal." Ryan shook his head instinctively. "That section is factory sealed," he replied, almost automatically. "There is no reason to open it. The system would flag any issue in that assembly." "The system is averaging," the old man said softly, smoothing out the inconsistency so it looks clean. That sentence landed differently, not as a theory, but as a possibility, and Lucas felt it click into place in a way the others had not yet allowed themselves to accept. He stepped toward the console, pulling up the data logs, scanning past the surface readings and into the deeper layers, looking for something irregular, something subtle, and there it was, barely visible unless you knew what you were looking for, a fractional delay between fuel delivery and response, small enough to pass, consistent enough to hide. "Sir," Lucas said, his voice tightening with realization, "there is a variance here, it is minor, but it is consistent across every attempt." Ryan moved beside him, eyes narrowing as he followed the data, his confidence shifting again, this time not collapsing, but recalibrating. "That should not be happening," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Behind them, the old man had already stepped back slightly, as if his role in that moment was complete, as if he had simply pointed out something the engine had been saying all along. Lieutenant Blake exhaled slowly, his posture changing just enough to signal a shift in authority, not lost, but redirected. "Open the panel," he said. Ryan hesitated for half a second, just long enough to acknowledge the weight of that decision, then nodded. "Get me a talk driver," he called out, and as one of the technicians moved to comply, the hangar seemed to settle into a new kind of silence, no longer frustrated, no longer confused, but focused, all of it now centered on a scene that had been there the entire time, waiting for someone to notice it. The talk driver clicked into Ryan's hand with a sharp, mechanical certainty that contrasted with the quiet tension settling over the team, and for a moment he just held it there, staring at the sealed panel as if it had become something more than metal, something that now carried weight beyond its design. "Factory seal," one of the technicians muttered under his breath, not as a warning, but as a reminder of procedure, of paperwork, of consequences that usually mattered more than instinct. Ryan did not respond immediately, his jaw tightening as he positioned the tool against the first fastener, the tip settling into place with a faint metallic tap that echoed louder than it should have in the stillness. "Break it," Lieutenant Blake said, his voice low but firm, not rushed, not pressured, just decisive, and that was enough. The first bolt gave way with a controlled snap, the seal breaking with a subtle crack that seemed to ripple through the entire hangar, not because of the sound itself, but because of what it represented, a shift from trust in the system to trust in something else entirely. One by one, the fasteners came loose, each turn deliberate, measured, until the panel eased free, and Ryan lifted it carefully, setting it aside with a precision that bordered on reverence. For a brief second, nothing looked wrong. The assembly inside was clean, intact, every component aligned exactly as it should be, no visible damage, no obvious obstruction, nothing that justified the hours of failure they had been facing. "There is nothing here," Ryan said, though the certainty was gone, replaced by something quieter, more cautious. The old man did not step forward right away, did not rush to prove a point, he simply watched, giving the moment space to reveal itself, and then he moved, just a single step, enough to lean slightly closer, his eyes narrowing as they adjusted to the subtle differences most would overlook. "Look again," he said softly. Ryan exhaled slowly and leaned in, this time not scanning for obvious faults, but searching for inconsistency, for something that did not match the rest, and it took a few seconds longer than it should have, but then he saw it, a hairline imperfection along a narrow fuel regulator channel, so small it could pass for a manufacturing variance, so precise it blended into the design, but not quite perfect, not quite right. "That should not be there," Ryan said quietly, almost to himself, reaching out with a gloved finger but stopping just short of contact, as if unsure whether touching it would confirm or deny what he was seeing. Lucas stepped closer, his breath held unconsciously as he followed Ryan's line of sight. "It is restricting flow," he said, the realization settling fully now, just enough to create a delay, but not enough to trigger a fault. The old man gave a slight nod, not of approval, but of recognition, as if the engine had finally been heard. "It is not broken," he said, "it is compensating." Ryan straightened slowly, the weight of that understanding settling across his shoulders, and for the first time since the failure began, his posture shifted, not defeated, not frustrated, but focused in a different way, recalibrated. "We adjust the channel," he said, thinking aloud now, his voice steadying as the path forward became clear, remove the restriction, restore direct flow. Lieutenant Blake watched him closely, then glanced briefly at the old man, a silent acknowledgement passing between them before he spoke again. "Do it," Blake said. Ryan nodded once, already reaching for the appropriate tool, movements precise, controlled, every action now guided by something beyond the diagnostic system that still glowed green behind them, unchanged, unaware that its authority had just been quietly, completely undone. Behind the team, the old man stepped back again, returning to the edge of the hangar, his hand slipping back into his jacket pockets, his presence fading just enough that if someone looked away for too long, they might forget he was ever at the center of it all, but the engine did not forget, and neither did Lucas, who kept his eyes on the man for a second longer, knowing without fully understanding that what had just happened was not luck, not guesswork, but something far older, something the system had never been designed to measure. Ryan worked with a precision that had returned to him in quiet increments, each adjustment measured down to fractions of an inch, the tool steady in his grip as he corrected the narrow imperfection in the regulator channel, not forcing it, not rushing it, but aligning it the way it should have been from the start, as if restoring something rather than fixing it. Around him, the team moved with a different kind of focus now, the earlier frustration replaced by a controlled attention that followed his lead without question, no one speaking unless necessary, no one breaking the rhythm that had settled into place. Lieutenant Blake stood just behind the line of technicians, arms no longer crossed, posture open, watching every movement with the awareness that something fundamental had shifted in how this problem was being approached. Lucas remained near the console, eyes flicking between the data and the open panel, tracking the changes as they happened, and even before the physical adjustment was complete, he saw the variance begin to tighten, the delay narrowing, the numbers aligning in a way they had not before, subtle but undeniable. Flow response is stabilizing, Lucas said, his voice low but clear, not announcing, just confirming what the system was finally beginning to admit. Ryan did not respond immediately, finishing the adjustment with a final careful turn before pulling the tool back, his gaze lingering on the corrected channel for a brief second as if committing the image to memory. "Seal it back up," he said, and the panel was returned into place, fasteners tightened in sequence, each click of the torque driver marking a step toward something that felt less like repair and more like restoration. Once the last bolt was secured, Ryan stepped back, exhaling slowly, his attention shifting to the cockpit controls. "All right," he said, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to reset the moment. "Let us see what she does now." The starter engaged again, the familiar whine building through the structure of the aircraft, but this time there was no hesitation, no falter, the sound carrying forward with a smooth continuity that had been missing before, and then, almost seamlessly, the engine came to life, a deep, steady roar that filled the hangar with a controlled power that resonated through the floor, through the air, through everyone standing there. No one cheered. No one spoke. The success did not need celebration, it demanded recognition, and for a few seconds, the only sound was the engine itself, running clean, responsive, exactly as it had been designed to. Ryan stared at it, not with pride, not with relief, but with a quiet respect, understanding now what had been overlooked, what had been missed despite all the systems and tools at his disposal. Lieutenant Blake shifted his gaze slowly from the aircraft to the edge of the hangar, where the old man still stood, hands in his pockets, posture unchanged, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. For a moment, Blake considered saying something, acknowledging it directly, but the words did not come. Because whatever had just occurred did not seem to require explanation or validation, it simply was. Lucas, however, did not look away. He stepped slightly closer to the old man, drawn not by obligation, but by something deeper, something that recognized the difference between knowledge and understanding. "Sir," he said quietly, careful not to break the calm that surrounded the moment, "how did you know?" The old man did not answer right away. He watched the engine for a second longer, listening to the steady rhythm, the absence of strain, the quiet honesty of a machine finally allowed to operate the way it was meant to, and then he gave the faintest hint of a smile, not directed at anyone in particular, but at the sound itself. "It told me," he said simply, and with that, he turned slightly, as if preparing to leave, his presence already beginning to fade back into the background, but the silence he left behind was no longer empty, it was filled with something that the system could never measure, and that no one in that hangar would forget. The engine continued its steady roar, not loud in a chaotic way, but controlled, balanced, the kind of sound that carried confidence rather than force, and slowly, almost reluctantly, Ryan reached forward and pulled the throttle back down, letting the noise taper off into a smooth idle before finally shutting it down completely, the silence that followed no longer empty, but full, like something had been settled rather than stopped. No one moved right away. The team stood where they were, not out of hesitation, but because the moment itself held them there, each of them replaying what had just happened, measuring it against everything they thought they knew, and finding something missing in that comparison. Lieutenant Blake was the first to shift, turning his head toward the far edge of the hangar again, but the space where the old man had stood was now empty, nothing left but the faint impression that someone had been there at all, and that absence carried its own weight. "Where did he go?" Blake asked, not sharply, not demanding an answer, just acknowledging the question out loud. Lucas looked toward the same spot, his brow tightening slightly. "He was right there," he said quietly, stepping forward a few paces as if expecting to find him just out of view. But there was nothing, no movement, no sign, just the open stretch of concrete and the distant hum of the facility beyond. Ryan exhaled slowly, running a hand over the back of his neck, the adrenaline of the moment fading into something more reflective. "Does anyone know who he was?" he asked, glancing around at the others, but the team only shook their heads, one by one, the answer the same across the board: no identification, no record, no acknowledgement of how he had even gotten inside a restricted maintenance bay without being stopped. Lucas turned back toward the console, something still pulling at his attention, something unfinished, and he began typing, not searching randomly, but with purpose, entering the name he had heard only once, spoken quietly, almost as an afterthought. Eli Carter. The system responded immediately, pulling up records that were not part of the standard access layer, files marked with classifications Lucas did not usually see, and as he opened the first entry, the air around him seemed to shift again, not with tension this time, but with realization. "Sir," Lucas said, his voice lower now, steadier, "you need to see this." Lieutenant Blake stepped beside him, eyes scanning the screen, and for a moment, his expression did not change, the training holding, the composure intact, but then it did, just slightly, just enough to show that something had landed. He was not just a mechanic, Lucas continued, reading as he went, he was attached to multiple experimental airframes, back when half these systems did not even exist yet. Ryan stepped closer as well, drawn in despite himself, his earlier skepticism replaced by a quiet focus. "What does that mean?" he asked. Lucas hesitated for half a second, then read the line that mattered most. "It means," he said slowly, "he worked on these aircraft before they were ever standardized, before the systems were designed to interpret them." That settled it, not with noise, not with reaction, but with silence, the kind that follows understanding rather than surprise. Lieutenant Blake straightened, his gaze lingering on the screen for a moment longer before shifting back toward the empty hangar space. "So he does not rely on the system," Ryan said, more to himself than anyone else. Lucas shook his head slightly. "No," he replied, "the system relies on what people like him already understood." And for the first time since the engine had started, no one looked at the aircraft, because the machine was no longer the center of the story, the absence of the man who had fixed it was. The screen remained open in front of them, the classified file still glowing faintly against the dimmed console light, but no one touched it now, no one scrolled further, because what they had already seen was enough to change the weight of everything that had just happened. Lieutenant Blake stood still for a moment longer, then reached forward and closed the file with a quiet tap, not out of dismissal, but out of respect, as if leaving it open would somehow reduce its significance. "Lock that," he said to Lucas, his voice low, controlled, carrying a tone that had not been there earlier, something closer to restraint than authority. Lucas nodded immediately, fingers moving across the keys to secure the record, the screen returning to its standard interface as if nothing unusual had ever been accessed, but the knowledge remained, settled in the back of his mind with a clarity he could not ignore. Behind them, the jet sat silent again, its surface catching the overhead lights in smooth reflections, unchanged in appearance, yet completely different in meaning, no longer a machine that had failed, but one that had simply been misunderstood. Ryan turned slowly toward it, studying the engine housing where the panel had been opened and sealed again, his eyes tracing the same scene the old man had followed, seeing it now not as a component, but as a conversation he had not known how to listen to before. "We ran every system," Ryan said quietly, not as a defense, but as a realization, and still missed it. "You did not miss it," Blake replied, his gaze still fixed forward, "you just trusted the wrong voice." That sentence settled between them, not heavy, not accusatory, but precise, and Ryan nodded once, accepting it without argument. Lucas stepped back from the console, his attention drifting again toward the far edge of the hangar, the empty space where the old man had stood, and something about that absence felt intentional now, not accidental, as if the man had never been meant to stay longer than necessary. "Sir," Lucas said carefully, "should we log his involvement?" Blake did not answer immediately. He walked a few steps toward the aircraft, stopping just short of the intake, his posture straight, his hands resting loosely at his sides as he looked at the engine, listening not to its sound, but to what it represented now. "No," Blake said finally, his voice quiet but certain, "there is nothing to log." Lucas hesitated for a brief second, not out of disagreement, but out of the instinct to document, to record, to preserve, and then he understood, not fully, but enough, and he gave a small nod, stepping back into place. Ryan exhaled slowly, glancing once more toward the hangar entrance, half expecting to see the old man there, watching, but the doorway remained empty, the outside light spilling in without interruption, ordinary, unchanged. "You think he will come back?" Ryan asked, the question leaving his mouth before he could stop it, and Blake allowed himself the faintest shift in expression, something that might have been a smile if it had lasted longer. "Men like that do not come back," Blake said, "they just show up when something needs to be understood." The words did not feel like speculation, they felt like fact, and for a moment, no one spoke, no one moved, because there was nothing left to add. The hangar returned to its normal rhythm slowly, technicians resuming tasks, equipment humming, routines re-establishing themselves, but underneath it all, something had changed, something that would not be written in any report or captured in any system log, a quiet recalibration of how they saw the machine, and more importantly, how they understood the difference between data and truth. The hangar lights dimmed slightly as the evening cycle began, casting longer shadows across the polished floor, and for the first time since the engine had come back to life, the space felt ordinary again, almost as if the moment had folded itself quietly into memory without leaving a trace, but for the people who had been there, nothing about it felt routine anymore. Ryan stood alone near the aircraft, running his hand just above the sealed panel without touching it, stopping short as if the metal itself deserved a kind of respect he had not considered before, his mind replaying every step, every assumption, every moment where the system had told him everything was fine, and how easily he had accepted that answer. A few yards away, Lucas lingered near the console, no longer searching the system, no longer needing to, because what he had learned could not be found in any database, and he understood now why the file had been buried the way it was, not to hide it, but because it did not fit into the way things were measured anymore. Lieutenant Blake moved slowly along the edge of the hangar, his pace unhurried, his posture calm, but his eyes sharper than before, taking in details he might have ignored just hours ago, small things, subtle alignments, the way a machine sat when it was truly at rest versus when it was compensating for something unseen. He stopped near the open bay door, looking out at the fading light beyond, then back at the aircraft, as if drawing a line between what they thought they understood and what they now knew they did not. "Run it again tomorrow," Blake said finally, his voice steady, directed toward no one in particular and everyone at once, not because it needs it, but because you do. Ryan nodded quietly, understanding the difference, and Lucas did the same, both of them aware that the next time they stood in front of a machine, they would not be listening to the system first. The hangar returned to motion in slow layers, technicians moving, tools being organized, routines re-establishing themselves, but beneath it all was a new kind of awareness, something that could not be taught, only experienced, something that had been handed to them without explanation and without recognition. Near the far wall, a maintenance log sat open on a small metal table, blank where the final entry should have been, and after a moment, Ryan walked over and picked up the pen, hesitating just long enough to consider what could be written, what should be written, and what would never make sense on paper. He set the pen down without marking the page, closing the log gently as if acknowledging that some things were not meant to be recorded, only remembered. Outside, the last of the daylight faded, and the hangar lights took over completely, steady and artificial, illuminating a machine that now sat quiet and complete, not because it had been forced into compliance, but because someone had understood it well enough to let it be what it was meant to be. And somewhere beyond the reach of those lights, unseen and unannounced, the kind of man who did not need recognition had already moved on, leaving behind nothing but a lesson that would not be forgotten, a quiet truth that did not need to be spoken aloud to be understood, because respect, like understanding, was never something a system could generate, it was something earned, something carried, and something remembered long after the noise had faded.